Hey everybody, welcome back to Reckoning with Jason Herbert. I am, of course, your host and creator, Jason Herbert. And this week we have a special episode for you. We're talking to my friend, Judith Scheele. She is a social anthropologist who has been studying the Sahara for decades. And she just wrote a brand new book about the Sahara Desert. It's an environmental history. It's a cultural history. It's an anthropological history of the Sahara Desert. And we had to have her on to talk about it. So sit back and relax because her conversation, this woman is amazing. Reckoning with Jason Herbert starts now. I'm Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner, but I live in Colorado. I'm a historian. I'm an outdoorsman, and I'm a movie buff. I hunt and I fish. I kayak and I climb mountains. I like to explore old places and ask new questions. I'm curious about the world. And this is a reckoning. We have the fancy countdown. So what time is it over there where you are now?
5.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So we've recorded now, as this podcast has gotten bigger and bigger, we've recorded a bunch of pods where it's either in London or Denmark or Paris and so forth. And I've just essentially ceded my Saturdays to my transnational. I was like, okay, we're just going to do this. So I'm so excited. I finished your book earlier in the week. I have so many questions to ask you about this. This was something I want to talk about a lot. Before we do that, do you want to introduce yourself to our audience and kind of go from there?
So my name is Judith Scheele. I'm a social anthropologist, which means I go and study history and the way people live all around the world, including Europe and America. But my speciality is the Sahara. And so I have been working on Saharan places for about 20 years, which as an anthropologist means you spend at least a year, ideally more, maybe 2 years, living in a place with a family very often, and you just try to understand why people do what they do, kind of the reasons behind the principles that they use to order their lives. And I've done field work in southern Nigeria, northern Mali, and northern Chad.
One of the things that I love so much about this book that we'll talk about today is I felt like we got this virtual tour of the Sahara, and I am excited to kind of pick this apart and talk about maybe misconceptions or maybe lack of conceptions, I think, when it comes to the Sahara. I think that at least for maybe American audiences, and certainly for me, I just have the idea of the Sahara as this place filled with sand. And I know it has people, but that's it. I don't have prior to reading the book, I didn't have a very detailed knowledge or understanding as far as the ecosystems there, the people who live there, maybe, the migration routes, the transfer of resources, of information. There's a lot going on here. But before we get into that, my big question is, Judith, why the Sahara for you? Like, you've been researching and writing about this place. You've been living here for so long. What drew you here to begin with?
Well, you can have the official answer, which is it's a great place to research because we know so little about it.
Mm-hmm.
And when you start doing your research, you kind of look for the gap, for the hole in the knowledge. And there are a lot of gaps in the Sahara. So it seemed, it made sense to go and work on it. And it takes large chunks of your life to work. So you have to choose quite wisely where you want to go. What actually happened is that I used to work in West Africa prior to doing my PhD after my master's degree. That was into the early 2000s. And at some point I had to go back to Europe and I didn't have any money. So I hitchhiked. And that was my first encounter with the Sahara. That was in 2001. So I was there in September 2001 in the middle of the desert, listening to the radio, and just everybody was going, what is going on? And we kind of all knew things would go wrong, but nobody knew how. So then I traveled and I went to Oxford to do a PhD. And I told my supervisor, I want to write a book on the Sahara. It's really cool. And he went, yeah, you're not. So then I did something else, working on northern Algeria. And as soon as I was a kind of academic grown-up, I decided to go back to this place that I'd seen, just because I saw all these people going everywhere. There were trucks. There was just loads of things happening, and I had just no idea what it was. So I thought maybe I could go and understand. It worked out.
First of all, the second answer is way more fun. than the first answer. Of course, there are amazing people there. Of course, it is this amazing space. But the personal I always love talking to people and finding out like what draws them to a place. For my own work as a scholar, I write on like the indigenous southeast of the United States, and how I ended up getting there was this complete I had no interest in writing about North American history at all, and then I got drawn back into it. I wonder, you said your advisor said absolutely no way. Which was similar to what I got when I was at the University of Minnesota doing my PhD. When you start talking about the Sahara, are there misconceptions that people come to you with, or that you find yourself, or maybe that you had when you were first exposed to the Sahara?
Well, there are loads. I think the Sahara is one of the places where it kind of accrues images that people have, and that's why. And it's they're misconceptions, but of course, when I was 20-something and I hitchhiked through the Sahara, I had all of the same ideas, and this is exactly why I loved it so much. So they're not totally misconceptions. So the image people have is of endless space and nomadic Tuareg or Arabs, great camel herds, solitude, and just being faced. Beauty, of course, there's huge environmental beauty. And I think it attracts a certain type of person in as much as it's seen as one of the great leftover wild spaces, I suppose. That's wrong. And that's what I try to show in my book. It's actually a highly civilized place. People have, in order to set up an oasis, you need to dig wells. So there are lots of human ingenuity in history has actually gone into shaping the Sahara that we then imagine to be empty. But of course, the first conception that brought me there isn't totally wrong either. It is a very beautiful place. And when you go there, so as you said, there's something, you just love it. And it's very attractive in that sense. So I suppose the first misconception would be that it's mostly empty, that not very much happens there. You can't really write the history of the Sahara because if nothing ever happened, what would you do? Then, this is also Africa, so it's very hard to write African history. Loads of people still think Africa never had a history until the European came. It's an odd place in as much as people might know about North Africa, they might know about sub-Saharan Africa, but the bit in between tends to kind of fall out in between the cracks of the way you kind of think about the world. I mean, what else do people think about it? It is hot. It is very hot. Not always. People tend to think of it as like a very large sandbox, which is true in some places. You have images of dunes, but mostly it's not that. It's actually highly diversified. They're very high mountain ranges, up to 11,000 feet. Sometimes it snows in the Sahara. There are places where you can go skiing in the Sahara. So you have all of this, huge variety, which is very easy to overlook. And I think one of the reasons you do is when you look at the satellite image, it just looks brown and you don't see all of the kind of detail, the terrain itself.
Well, you talk about this early in the book, too, about the problems with mapping of like the fact that, if you look at just a 2D image on a textbook, right, where a lot of our students get first exposed to, say, African history or geography or things like that, and you just see this big sandy color. You see Northern Africa and you see the lush jungles of of Central Africa and so forth. And then there's just this big brown splotch. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because this is not a new problem, correct? Like we've seen, you talk in the book about how people started to conceptualize the Sahara especially as people come to it maybe from the outside, I guess maybe might be the way to talk about it. Can we talk about the problems with mapping the Sahara itself? Like where is it and what is it is maybe the best question to start with.
Well, so for one, it's big. So that's
huge.
So it covers about a third of the African continent, which is big. It's usually bigger than we think because the way world maps tend to be projected, actually Africa looks much smaller than it should. It looks brown on satellite images, and actually the word Sahara, which is an Arabic word, means sandy brown. So this is not just totally European preconception. The thing with satellite images, of course, is that we know them now, but for most of human history, they were not available to anyone. So the looking at something from the top, we are used to it because we're used to maps, but that's a very recent development. When it first started, it was an imagination. People couldn't know what a map would look like. They went through very complicated math to have some idea. And most of the descriptions we have of the Sahara is not in the form of maps. Once you go back in history, people have itineraries. So quite recently, if you want to go to the Sahara, and even in the 19th century when the French came and tried to conquer it, what they wanted to know is not so much what the place looks like, but how to get to a place and how long it would take. and whether you can find water and who you might meet. So you have these travel descriptions, and those go back a very long time. They go back to the Greeks. So we have a very famous one from the 5th century BCE by Herodotus, where he says, well, you travel for 10 days and then you meet somebody and then you say, some people say that's not really what the Sahara looks like, but maybe this is how people experience the Sahara. And this way of thinking about space is what most Saharans today do too. Again, if you live in this place and your problem is not really what it looks like, but you need to know how to get to the nearest border post, or how to, if you work as a trader, you want to know about travel. And to translate this into kind of a map, you have to do quite a lot of imagination, but also violence to local conceptions. So if you talk to Saharans today, of course, now they know there's such a thing as the Sahara, but what they really care about is their close environment. Also, very often, if you're Saharan, you want to get out of the Sahara, so they might be more interested in, say, how to get to Libya and get where there's money and work than in Mauritania, if this is not nearby. So and also from the inside, Saharans have always thought about the Sahara, of course, not as a desert, as in a place where nobody lives, because they live there, it makes sense. And so they would think about it in terms of different kind of ecozones, different places where you can take your camels, places where you might meet your mother-in-law, places where you go on pilgrimage. So they have a very differentiated vocabulary, some of which might mean desert and other things mean other things. And they're very often about resources, really kind of answering practical problems of how to survive. Whereas your big bird's eye map, of course, doesn't tell you very much. And because the Sahara looks so empty, because you have less roads, less cities, etc., there's a tendency, especially in Europe and American textbooks, to zoom out. So you have the Sahara, usually it fits very neatly on an A4 page. If you think about the real size, you would never do that, say, about all of the USA. Or sometimes you do, but you're aware that you don't see very much on these maps. So the maps, in a sense, have been a problem. And they're still, when they're being used today in kind of security, they're still a problem because you have this very small map. And hence you might very easily feel threatened by things that actually happen 5,000 kilometers away from you. But because the map is small, you think, oh, no, it's right next door.
Yeah, and I've got questions here. For our audience here, the Sahara, it's a transnational space, right? There are multiple nations that engage with or claim parts of that. And I'm wondering, as you've been a scholar of this space now for decades. Who controls the Sahara? Is it multiple nations? Like, how do these nations? I look at things as an environmental historian now, thinking, oh wait, how are these places managed? Who has rights to these places? What happens when there are conflicts over management desires? Because as you reveal in the book, there's actually quite a bit of resources here as well that people have interest in. I guess, Judith, who's in control of the Sahara?
Well, that's a big question, I think.
So, you have 6 hours to respond.
Okay, so on paper, there are 11 nation states that control the Sahara. None of them, or almost none of them, are only Saharan. So mostly what happens is a bit like Algeria. So you have most people living on the coast. And then because of colonial history, they have a huge bit of Sahara stacked to their territory. So nominally, it's controlled by the government. Now, a lot of these countries, some of these countries, the North African ones, are relatively wealthy. Libya, Algeria, they have oil. So they actually have a functioning army, they have a road network, and Algeria recently built a wall all along the Saharan borders, 6,000 kilometers, so they have means to control the space. And further south, you have countries like Mali, Chad, Burkina Faso, Niger, they count among the poorest countries in the world. And very often they don't have a state apparatus that they might control their capital cities, but they certainly don't control all of the desert. Partly also because they don't see the point, because there are people there, but not that many people. And we now are used to countries controlling all of their national territory. But why would you, if you don't actually get any revenue from this territory? So if you think of, a third of your national territory, there's not very much in it. The people who live there don't actually pay taxes anyway. They just kind of run away when you come. So why invest a lot of money into building roads, schools, posting your army? A country like Mali can't do that. So what happens then is when you have resources that are important. So, for example, in Niger, the army arguably doesn't control very much, but they have a uranium mine. So the uranium mine, people will start sending military, and also the uranium mine usually sold off. So you have multinational companies. So they then start controlling bits of the space. Unofficially, everybody knows, of course, but you can't officially. So you get that kind of layered sovereignty. And then you get bits where there's not very much going on. And usually it's local people who control the space. They might not want to control all of the space. They usually tend to control the bits that are interesting for them. So maybe an oasis, maybe a border post, maybe a mine, maybe a road where everybody has to travel through. So they sit there and they kind of tax you when you pass. And because the security situation in the Sahara is pretty bad right now, what happens is that wherever you go, there will be different types of people who might have guns, and they might stop you and say, you pay a little bit of money, and then you go on. They might belong to a state, they might not belong to a state, Libya is very complicated because you have these militias and they say they belong to a state, but there's two states and maybe they just hired the uniform for the day. You just have no idea of telling. So basically it's quite complicated.
I can't imagine the difficulty of traversing the space as an outsider and trying to negotiate all of the geopolitics and the local politics at play with a space as big as the Sahara. Were there times when you were going through there where you ever felt like unsafe as a scholar or challenged?
For most people, they knew what I was doing. I would always try to explain. They usually thought, I worked a lot with transnational smugglers, so they actually have quite an interesting income. And so first thing when I said I'm writing a book, they said, oh, how much are you going to sell it for? And then when I told them, they just laughed and said, why don't you do something else with your life?
Thank you.
But usually, they would first and foremost see me as a woman who had asked to travel through the area. And usually I was staying with their family, or I wouldn't just go and show up. For instance, when I was in Nigeria, I wanted to travel to Mali. The family I was staying with would ask somebody they knew. If they don't knew somebody, so basically you're not just a random foreigner, but you are somebody's friend. And I think I say that in the book. There was a problem because at first I was staying with this very high-ranking religious family. I had worked on their manuscript collections, and I was always fully veiled. And when they put me on a truck with the Tuareg driver, at first nobody would talk to me because they were being very respectful. Mm-hmm. Of course, wanting to do research, that's not really good. You do want people to talk to you. So it took me several days to kind of say, well, you can actually, I'm interested in what you're doing. But you basically do what you're told. You can't just go on your own. You ask people who know better. And because so many people make their living from knowing how to travel, there's always somebody who knows. And there were situations when people really said, no, we don't know what's going on, then I just wouldn't go. There were other situations. There was a funny moment when I was in northern Mali. I wanted to go back to Algeria and I wanted a visa to go back. And I was the only person with only one passport. I was surrounded by these travelers and they all had 5 or 6 passports and they just laughed at me. They just went, well, just fake it. I don't know. I can't really fake my document. That's just not. So and at the end, I didn't fake it. But yeah.
Can I ask you about the people of the Sahara? Right? Is it a single ethnic group? Are there multiple groups? Who lives in the Sahara? Who I guess draws upon the resources of the Sahara for their own livelihood? Like who's there, Judith?
So traditionally, you have 3 major kind of historically nomadic groups. Mm-hmm. You can't really talk about them as ethnic groups because there's a lot of intermarriage. These are all very mobile people, but language tells you something, and that's how people identify themselves. So you have, in the West, you have people speaking a variety of Arabic. People live in Mauritania, Morocco. In the center, you have the Tuareg. They speak a variety of Berber. There's loads of sub-variety, but anyway, you can talk to them, and they identify as Tuareg. They're perhaps the largest group. And then towards the east, you have Tubu. They're kind of darker skinned, much less well known. They're not, they haven't kind of monopolized Saharan law as much as the Tuareg have, but they live pretty much in the same way. So camel nomads, they tend to be veiled. And then once you go a little bit further south, you have various sedentary groups because most people in the Sahara are actually not nomadic and never have been. So you have people living in oases, you have people living kind of at the border where you can do a little bit of agriculture, mm-hmm. There's salt mines, etc. And they tend to speak either Arabic in the north or in the south, they speak Kanimbu, Songhai. So the language is spoken slightly further south than the Sahel. And historically, what happens is that people would identify where you belong to, but because there's so much intermarriage, because life in the Sahara is always risky, any slight environmental change, your camels might die, your cows might die. If it doesn't rain enough in one space, you have a problem. So people tend to not put their eggs in the same basket. So ideally, if you can, you try to get wives from different geographical zones. Ideally, somebody might be sedentary. So if all goes wrong, you can go and stay with her family. So there's a lot of mix. And most Saharans I know speak 3, 4, 5 languages. quite fluently. But they would still identify usually us as one. But usually your father's family is the one that's important, but not always. So you can really play on multiple identities.
All right, this is where the environmental historian in me just wants to pick apart so many different questions and ask you so many different things. Because the thing that comes to mind as you talk about these folks is how incredibly resourceful they are to pull their lives together through living, in these spaces. And I'm wondering, like, how does a person live there, Judith? Like, is it agriculture? Is it hunting? Is it trade? Like, how does a person actually survive the Sahara?
Yeah, well, there's many ways. So in the past, the
Yes.
kind of classic images you had, on the one hand, people who were more or less sedentary, so they would live in an oasis. Most of these oases are man-made, so they rely on irrigation. So you have these images of kind of lakes in the desert and palm trees and
palm trees.
one
Yeah.
or two of them, but mostly people at some point decided they were going to set up an oasis and they started digging. So they dig wells, they dig irrigation canals. There's very sophisticated, very old ways of getting water because the Sahara has a lot of water, but it's under the surface. What you need to do is get it out. So in order to have an oasis, you need agriculturalists, but you also usually need some input from the outside. So most oases were probably set up not just to grow dates, but also to trade. So there were trading posts, going back to the idea if you want to travel across the Sahara, you need to have stopping over points. Then you have nomads, people who have livestock. In some parts of the Sahara, that's possible. In others, it's not. And usually it's quite hard to just have camels. So most of these nomads, they also have, very often, maybe the men will go and have camels. Some of their cousins will have cows further south. The women will look after goats. Goats are extremely important. And the goats like the mountains, so they would live in the mountains. So you stretch out and you try to find little bits of niches where you can live with the animals. Everybody would do a bit of trade on the side, because it's nice to have camels, but you can't just drink camel milk. At some point, you get very hungry. So ideally, you exchange your camels against dates or cereals. Because you have the camels, you control movement, so you can go and raid some people or control them or ask for taxes. So basically, most people try to combine as many resources as possible. Historically, there were also salt mines, which are really important. Salt doesn't sound very exciting, but West Africa doesn't really have much salt on its own, and you can't live without salt. So there's a huge trade in salt, which was probably as important as the gold trade. So it's really a big thing. Nowadays, there's oil in Libya and Algeria. So Libya, Algeria are rich countries, which also meant that they built roads, they built hospitals, they built schools. So you also have a lot of school teachers and nurses and doctors and people who cater for the people who work on the oil plants, so traders, shopkeepers, and increasingly also have migrants arriving from West Africa, because the economies in a lot of West African countries have really gone nosediving down. And so people move into Libya and Algeria to work. Some of them try to travel on to Europe. So you have the very cosmopolitan, for the last 30 years, you've had a very cosmopolitan urban population of people from all over West Africa.
I wonder if we can talk about oases for a second here, because you mentioned a couple different times. You talk about it quite a bit in the book, and you're absolutely right. Like, I imagine almost like the old Bugs Bunny cartoons, where there's somebody kind of dragging their way through the desert, and then there's an oasis, and there's water, and there's whatever. You say that they're, in a lot of ways, oases are no paradise. Can you unpack that a little bit and talk about, like, what's the process of creating an oasis, and why, or I guess maybe they're so important, and why are they so easy to maybe mischaracterize in our own minds?
Well, we don't really know. Some of these oases are very old, so they've been there. So we don't know. We know they've been there for a long time. We don't know what went on in people's minds when they first set them up. So this is a little bit of speculation. What we do know, and partly we know so little because there's not very much archaeology that has been kind of archaeological digs. So the bits we know more about, like Libya and Morocco, it's not that they were exceptional. It's just because there was a team who did all the work. And these archaeological digs show us that these oases are very old. They also show us, and archaeologists tend to link them to very gradual climate change. So at some point, the Sahara was full of people, and then it got drier and drier about 10,000 years ago. And the people who lived there and didn't want to leave started to dig down to try to get at the water. And they had various inventions, some of them from Egypt, some of them from further east. So we know that there was a lot of contact with, say, Iran, where they developed very early on a canal system, which is the system by which you dig tunnels under the ground until you find water and then kind of channel this water to your oasis. once you've mastered that technique, it means you can't set up an oasis anywhere, but you can choose a strategic location. And so we can then guess that people, when they first showed up with the idea of building an oasis, first they needed quite a lot of money. They needed to have a strong idea why they wanted to set up a settlement. And they needed a lot of patience because oases grow mostly dates, and dates take a long time to grow. And although you can also grow other stuff, I mean, the main production is dates. And nobody really wants to just eat dates. I mean, I've eaten a lot of dates in my life, but at some point you just want to eat some cereal, some vegetables. So basically, we can guess that these oases were set up to produce things for trade. So probably by people from the outside who wanted to trade across the Sahara and just needed a stopping over point somewhere, and hence set them up. So we can't just understand them as kind of spontaneous villagers growing up. We need to think about them, how they fit into a much larger project.
I can't think about the Sahara without thinking about camels. You talk about camels a lot in this book. My first book is actually about cattle in Florida. Can we talk about what does the camel do for human intervention in the Sahara? Why is this is this animal from the Sahara? Does it get brought to the Sahara? And what is this relationship between humans, camels, and camelids, I suppose, and the desert look like?
So camels are incredibly important. They used to be and they still are. Kind of in a nutshell, what they did is allow humans to go to places where they couldn't go before because they're so resilient, because somebody says they turn salty water into sweet milk. And so they basically bring human life to areas where before then you just couldn't go. They also gave some people a great advantage. If you think in terms of military technology, it's a bit like having horses in the Middle Ages. So if you see a camel, if somebody sits on a camel with a lance, you're not going to negotiate. You're just going to say, yes, I will do what you say. So they allow people to control mobility and transport, which is crucial. On the other hand, camels are not indigenous to the Sahara. So they were brought there. They come from Arabia. So they were brought there by people. You could also ask what humans have allowed camels to do. It's a symbiosis. Camels arrived about 2,000 years ago in the Sahara. They took some time before then you had horses. There's a moment we have a lot of rock painting of horses. So people clearly liked horses a lot too. I think for the same reason, because they make you go really fast and hence you can be you can lord it over everybody else. Nowadays, and we know, camels were used to use their wool to make tents. You can eat their meat, you can drink their milk. They're terribly versatile. And also they're very different. Again, we talk about camels, but in local languages, you don't have one word for camel. You have about 25. There's just the idea that we would talk about a camel speaking about a very young male animal and say a 3-year-old female one, it's just not the same thing. Some camels are for carrying loads, some are beautiful, some can run really fast. So there's a kind of culture of camels that we find difficult to understand. Nowadays, camels are still incredibly important, although people have cars, of course. So most of the being super fast and having the military advantage is now about having jeeps, Toyota 4x4s. But people still keep their camels, and I think that's partly because it makes sense economically. You can sell meat. A lot of the Sahara, you just can't do anything else. You can't really do agriculture. So having camels makes sense. But also because they're still seen as a sign of prestige. So for a lot of Saharans, camels is what being Saharan means, having something to do with camels in one way.
This does not sound too dissimilar to the many Native American tribes that I work with out here in the United States who have horse culture, right? And very much identify themselves as their tribe's historic relationship to horses, right? And obviously that's changed with advent of cars and colonialism and all this kind of stuff. But yet, when you look at, say, tribal insignias or different things like that, it's almost always, if you say, look at the Comanche logo, there's a man on horseback with a lance, very much tying back to this idea of the relationship to this animal. It sounds very similar to me, Judith. Is that about right?
I said people have managed to set up niches within the Sahara in particular places by connecting different resources over space. But actually what happens is that humans and camels and other animals together created these niches, because if you take your camels to pasture in the same space year after year, this space is going to change. Because camels eat certain herbs, they don't eat others, because they kind of fertilize. Basically, so humans have shaped, it doesn't look like it in Sahara, but humans have shaped the landscape of the Sahara, and they haven't done it on their own. They've done it very much relying on camels. And there's been research done in how camel mothers teach their young to graze in certain ways. And that's actually very specific from one group to another, from one camel to another. So you have these kind of very, very close circular relationships that have turned the Sahara into what it is.
All right. Well, I have to ask you this because there was if you were to look at my copy of this beautiful book right here, you would see there's a good section of it that is highlighted and footnoted that I made notes to put into my own work because I loved it. And I want to ask you about this, what you refer to as the permanent crisis of pastoralism. Can we talk a little bit about what that means?
So I think it means, when I put it in, mostly meant it to mean the way people have forever said pastoralists are going to die out.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, forever, starting from the 19th century, this idea that we were all going to modernize and there's nothing could be more archaic than pastoralism. Going back to, evolutionary ideas. We used to be hunter-gatherers, then became nomads, and now we're all sedentary, and wow, isn't this wonderful? The thing is that pastoralists haven't died, they're just still there. So they're very stubbornly, they just continue to exist, even in places like Algeria, which is a thoroughly modern country, and they're kind of this oddity. But once you look into what they're actually doing and how they're making use of marginal environments, of course, it makes sense. Nobody else could do it as well as they do it. So that's one answer. So these kind of permanent crisis, people always say, well, they're going to die. And I see it with my students. I mean, to actually get them to talk about pastoralists in like the present tense, it's hard. You really have to. On the other hand, when you look at statistics, pastoralism is thriving. So there are more and more animals, especially in the southern Sahara. Countries like Chad, over the last 20 years, I think that the livestock has gone up 3 or 4 times. So you have these huge herds of animals. And they're very impressive when you go, suddenly they show up and you have these kind of, it's like a sea of camels or cows crossing your path. Again, this doesn't mean that nothing has changed. These, especially in Chad, these herds are actually owned by people close to the president who have the means to, if they say, don't pasture your camels here, well, they say, actually, we will, because the president happens to be my brother. So the histories of power are always kind of reflected in pastoralism. And the other reason is, of course, because pastoralism, as I said, people are, what they're good at is knowing about camels, but also knowing about the environment, which is changing all of the time. Hence, they're flexible. So in terms of kind of resilience and adaptability, this is really it. I mean, your pastoralist is the kind of avant-garde modern worker, and hence pastoralists have managed to adapt to the very many changes. And what they've done in Chad, for instance, or Niger, is that now they're selling camel meat to Nigeria. And, Lagos is one of the biggest cities in the world. You can sell them camels forever. They're still going to be hungry. So there's a lot of even economic interest there.
All right, now I have to ask you about being an anthropologist, because this is diving into so much. I'm about to head to the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation. I'm not an anthropologist by training. I took courses, certainly, but I feel like every person to some degree is an anthropologist, as we are trying to understand the other people. And I'm wondering, Judith, like when you were out here and you've done these visits and research trips, you're talking about pastoralism and things like that. Were you allowed to go out and like visit with these herds or see them firsthand? And I guess the big thing I remember from all of my anthropology classes was hearing that, food is culture. So what's that like for you when you go to someone's, I'm assuming folks are sharing with you their food and so forth. Like, what's your experience has been like when you go to the Sahara and people share, hey, this is how we live. This is what we do. These are the foods that we eat. Like, how do you as a person do that? Like, how's that been for you?
Well, it's surprisingly easy, actually. People in most places are nice. You respect them and they tend to respect you.
Absolutely.
The ones who don't want to talk to you, well, you can't force, they just won't. I mean, you're in a position of not really weakness, but basically whatever you can do, you do it because people want to share their time. If they don't, they won't. If there's something they won't tell you, well, they won't tell you. That's it. And sharing people's lives, I mean, that's what I really like about my job, to be honest. I mean, the food isn't always great. Sometimes it can be very good, but just being let into somebody else's life, and it can be very boring. Sometimes nothing happens. The pastoral life is nice, but you spend most of the time waiting for the animals to do whatever they're doing. Coming from the context of a Western university where you're always constantly working, you kind of learn to just stop and just wait. And a lot of the things I learned from women hanging out, drinking tea, because it gets very hot in the middle of the day. So what you do, you kind of, in the Mauritanian Arabic, people say we'll have the nap together, we'll have the siesta together, we spend the day together. And then a lot of things come because you just talk a little bit, sometimes you don't. So you get used to this very different rhythm. You also sometimes get used to slightly odd food, but you share, you eat what everybody else has. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more. I think the worst experience was when I was in northern Chad, which was when Gaddafi was brought down. So Libya was falling apart, and Gaddafi had stockpiled a lot of flour from Ukraine, and that was all flooding down into Chad. hundreds, just these huge bags of flour. So everybody started trafficking in flour, and all we ever ate for a year was boiled flour, which was terrible.
Do you have favorite foods that you've eaten in the Sahara that you found that you really liked?
Well, Timbuktu is a very nice place. You have the fabled city of Timbuktu, which a
Mhm.
lot of it isn't actually true, but in terms of the culture of food and language and poetry, they make very nice food, yes.
Well, I'm sorry, but speaking of Timbuktu, you mentioned this early in the book about the perceptions of the Sahara as like the end of the world, and saying Timbuktu itself. And then what I knew, but as a huge Star Wars fan, completely had forgotten was about Tatooine being also a word. It's the space. It feels so alive to me, despite uh, all of the preconceptions of it being this end of the world kind of space. When you talk about the foods that you've eaten, the places you've been, the people you've encountered. I want to ask you though about migration. It seems to be this. The Sahara, in so many ways, when I read your book, felt like almost a verb. Judith, it felt like this space in which people are coming and going and doing. It was like the Sahara felt like an action to me. And I was kind of wondering if you can kind of talk about how does migration fit into this, including slavery? Like slavery still, are we still seeing human trafficking in the Sahara today? I was just kind of wondering like where does this fit into the narrative of this space?
It's a difficult question because on the one hand, you have basically layers of things going on. So historically, the Sahara is a place where people have always moved into and through. It's a difficult
Mm-hmm.
space. It's a space where if you don't have connections, you don't have very many chances of survival. Of course, being connected can happen in very many different ways. It can be relatively egalitarian. It can also be through subordination. It's also, we talked about oases and how in order to build one, you need to dig. Of course, most people don't want to do the digging. It's really terrible work. And the most common solution in the past was to go and raid slaves or buy them and bring them into the Sahara, which is still reflected in contemporary Saharan populations. So you can see a lot of the sedentary oases, the population is of slave descent, more or less. Although most of them now have acquired quite a lot of political freedom, it's still a political issue because nobody wants to be told that they're of slave descent. It's still a common insult in Northern Africa. So you have
Really?
the history of slavery, of course, the history of trans-Saharan slave trade, which, I mean, all of these issues it's difficult because on the one hand, you have little actual historical research that goes beyond the European sources. So we still don't know that much. On the other hand, it's terribly politicized. So people will go and try to compare trans-Saharan slave trade to the transatlantic slave trade for reasons that have little to do with history. So they might say, well, but look, the Arabs actually exported more slaves than the Americans. So does that make American slavery better? I mean, it's just totally meaningless. But you have these debates going. So it's very hard to actually get reliable figures, and you have to be very careful. What we do know is that loads of people were brought across the Sahara, which you can still see. And one of the kind of side effects of the Arab Springs has been that black populations in North Africa have started to speak out more and become more visible. They've always been there. But, if you think of Tunisia, you don't think 15% of Tunisians are black, but they are. So why? So it's an interesting question in terms of, which goes back to kind of larger questions about race. When does race become race? And what can you see and what can't you see? Is it because people are so subordinate that they don't dare speaking out? Or is it because there's no need to? So it's very complicated. But because of the kind of the politics of it, which are important, sometimes it hides the kind of facts behind what's going on. And a lot of them we don't really know yet. And so there's one layer of migration. Then on top of that, you have the fact that people also move voluntarily, and that we shouldn't, just because today you have a lot of people from Black Africa, West Africa, especially Central Africa, moving into the Sahara, that doesn't mean that they're doing the same thing as when slaves were being traded into the Sahara. So you have to be very careful. What is going on today is that, as I said, West Africa, Central Africa, there are huge economic and political crises, and people can't move. They used to move to Europe, which is almost impossible now because of visa restrictions, and hence they move to Libya and Algeria, which are relatively rich countries where people look for labor, cheap labor, so migrants can provide that. But there are also countries in which politically, this is not at all recognized. So there's quite a lot of racism in Algeria. Libya, we heard about it during the war. So people were even attacked for being too dark. And so these are very, very complicated issues, but they're not new. And I think, the image I want to bring across in my book is really of the Sahara as a place where people meet, and societies that, because they've always relied on people coming in from the outside, they're actually quite good at incorporating them, which doesn't mean everybody gets along happily. And slavery is never nice. And I think, again, that's a debate, or is this slavery nicer than others? It's just meaningless. If you're a slave, you're a slave. But I think it can help us to think through these questions elsewhere in different terms. So you have in the Sahara, you have a history of slavery, you have a history of race. It's the same colors, it's black and white and brown and whatever you can find in between, but it's not quite the same. And I think we have to be careful to really study things from the inside up and just see what people themselves think about these things, rather than saying, oh, it's just like the US or it's totally different. But it's an interesting case because it's both different and the same in a sense.
Sure. I want to ask you, because I don't get a chance to actually talk about French history very often here on this podcast. And the question I have is quasi-related maybe to the American experience with indigenous people or American imperialism elsewhere and things like that. I wonder, Judith, does France wrestle with its relationship to the Sahara or towards colonialism there in Africa, or vice versa? Is there a relationship between the peoples of the Sahara? Do people talk about France at all? What does that look like?
Again, it's a 6-hour question. Well, France.
Yes, you're welcome.
France wrestles with its relationship to its colonial history. It's difficult, as they're just about coming to terms. I think a lot of the developments that have happened elsewhere 20 years ago are now arriving in France. And of course, there's a lot of resistance everywhere in the world right now. So there are things you can say, things you can't say, and you're very easily accused of being anti-Western or what, you know all the terms.
I get on social media and my head explodes.
Exactly.
So, yes.
So you get the same thing just with the French touch happening in France. And the French touch partly saying, oh, this is all American debates, they're not for us. So this is kind of double idea. This is American imperialism. While actually what is at stake is French imperialism. So all very complicated. The Sahara doesn't come into it so much, partly because a lot of these debates are, of course, pushed forward by people from the former colonies in France. Mm-hmm. And there are just many more people from Algeria, especially from Algeria, but also from Mali, from more popular zones. So Saharans don't migrate that much. There are not that many of them. And very often they didn't have access to French schools or don't have access to education right now. So you don't get many Saharans in France. So in a sense, I think that has led a lot of French people to think that they're nice and they're less of a bother. So you have this very exoticizing image. There's a lot of tourism in the Sahara. It's a very French thing for kind of elderly French people to go and be driven around. They can't do it anymore, but it was a big thing at some point. So you have a kind of positive image of the Tuareg too. For the long time, the French thought the Tuareg were pro-French, which goes back to colonial history. It's been disproven all of the time, but still they kind of hold on to this idea, which sometimes translates into real policy moves. And I think that in a sense it's quite funny, but we can see the French army intervened in northern Mali in 2011, 2012. Mm-hmm. A lot of the leading officers then, they've now published their memoirs. And you can see in their memoirs how much they were influenced by this very colonial, romanticized image of the Sahara. So it still has a real impact on the ground because these are people actually making decisions and they have big guns. So it's not just quaint. It's a very complicated story. Also because the Sahara has oil, the French didn't want to let go of the Sahara. They were happy to let go of the rest of Algeria. They wanted to keep the oil. There were nuclear testing in the Algerian Sahara on the basis that nobody lives there, so it doesn't really matter. Of course, people did live there. And some of them are now coming and saying, look, the cancer in my family, maybe it's related. So these are big taboo questions that are being asked, but the answers haven't been found yet, I think.
Yeah, it's the imperial question. Like there are so many countries. It's a bigger conversation than we have time for here today. And it's like the United States is certainly not alone in its imperial aims or its imperial actions and so forth. So I'm always interested to hear like the similarities, differences, like what are people going through, how they're thinking about their places in the world. And maybe the best way to do that in a lot of different ways is actually through film. This podcast initially started as a film podcast. I started talking about movies years ago on Twitter back when we were all over there. I'm wondering, Judith, and you mentioned this early on, are there on-screen depictions of this area that you like, that you've seen? How do movies, because the first thing when I first was introduced to your work, the first thing is like, oh, let's talk about Lawrence of Arabia, or let's talk about Star Wars, or let's talk about the movie Sahara with Matthew McConaughey. Are there what are your thoughts about the way that the Sahara is depicted on screen in film?
Well, I haven't. I mean, I probably haven't watched all of these films, but it's a very beautiful setting. That's why so many films are being shot in the Sahara. And I think the Sahara, as in Star Wars, is probably the one that most people have seen more than anything else. You get The English Patient too, which is very much into There's one film. I think it's a Mauritanian film, but it's in French, so it might not have been seen very much beyond France. It's called Timbuktu.
Okay, I've heard of this film.
Which is interesting because it was funded and done with the help of the French army and the Mauritanian army at a time when the French army had just intervened in northern Mali to fight against Islamists who had taken over Timbuktu. So it's all about this. And it's a very beautiful film. I mean, the landscapes are it's a Mauritanian film I like very much, and he really knows what he's doing. But once you pick apart the story, you can see how much of it is really about the fantasized image of the Sahara as not really a Muslim place where people are nice, and then kind of foreign Arabs come in and they break everything. So it's a lot of cliches and a kind of very strong political message that's probably not the right message to send right now. But within this very beautiful film. So I feel very ambivalent about it because it's nice to have a beautiful film from the area, but it shows you, I think, how difficult it is to say anything neutral or objective right at the moment. But it's worth watching if you...
Well, it's perfect because Americans are famously monolingual, so we could just put that on here in the States. No one will know any of the words, and they could just look at the pretty pictures of this area. We'll find it. We'll find a light of hope here. I'm wondering, every single book that gets written has things that don't make it into the book. Everything has something that gets cut out. Were there parts of this book that you had to cut out, or that you wish you had been able to talk about more, or that you were saving for another project? Like, what's not in the book, I guess, is my question, Judith. Here's your chance to talk about things that didn't make it into the pages.
These are things that are not in the book, but they're things that... At first, when I wrote the first project, I wanted to have a whole chapter on women, because I thought you don't see them often enough. At least the stereotypical image of a Saharan is a nomad, light-skinned, turban, camel, and you don't hear very much about the women. And in my experience, the women are actually the ones who make the whole thing, keep the whole thing together. And partly because the men are never there. They're always doing something else. They're trading, they're looking after their camels, they're migrating, they are generally useless, they're doing politics. So most of the life I saw was women. And they talk about the history as if it was all done by men. So they will glorify the men and tell the stories. But it's all the women who remember. The men might not even know the story. So it's really a kind of patriarchal society held together by women. And it's not that patriarchal, especially in Mauritania. Women have great freedom. You have these great traders who go off to China and buy veils and bring them back and have bank accounts in Dubai. So that's the bit I like most about the Sahara, really hanging out with these very interesting and very kind of polyglot women. And my editor said, no, you don't need a chapter on women. Why do you want to do that for? And then I didn't. And actually, I'm quite glad I didn't, because a lot of the book talks about women and the experience I had with them. And in a sense, having just a chapter on women is a bit like having Mother's Day. It means all the other days you can be horrible to your mother. So I hope the perspective is still there. I would have liked it just to say the Sahara is full of women. There are more women than men, and we really need to pay attention to what they're doing. But maybe that's a different.
Perhaps after reading this book, I'm ready for your next book. I wonder, climate change becomes a big, important thing here in the United States. I'm sure it's a global thing. In the United States, we like to pretend it doesn't happen, as currently in our current regime over here. I'm wondering, when you've spent all this time studying the history of the Sahara, you spent all this time getting to know the people there, the present of the Sahara. I'm wondering, Judith, when you look forward to what comes next for this region, are there concerns that you're worried about? Are they geopolitical? Are they environmental? When you talk to people there, are they expressing fears or concerns, or what comes next for the Sahara?
Well, I don't know. it's not a particular good time. And I think I said that in the book. I started writing it a few years ago and I was feeling much more positive. But the last few years have been really disastrous, especially not actually for the whole Sahara, if you think about it. I mean, there have been several coups. Most people down the Sahara live under military regime. Very often a military regime that kind of legitimizes its actions by kind of anti-imperial, anti-France, anti-French stance. So I can understand, but still the effects on people have been dire. So people have even less food and even less access. And there's even more men with guns, which is generally not a good thing. I mean, I can see why in terms of national sovereignty, why this might be important, but still having more young men with guns, I've seen them rather not. So that's pretty bad. The climate change issue is a bit different because I mean, same in Europe, some people just don't believe it is happening. In the Sahara, people know. It's not that they know it will happen. They know that it has happened, that they know it is happening. They survive because they're very keen observers of their natural environment, and they will be able to tell you that over the last 10, 20 years, things have changed. For them, basically, climate change started in the 1970s. There were catastrophic droughts, and things have gone better, but not really back to normal. That doesn't mean things are getting drier. It just means things are much more unpredictable than before. So there's not even less rainfall, but there might just be too much in one place. It's basically they're finding it hard to cope with the environment. They don't really get a choice. The idea that everybody will leave, no, that's not what happens. They don't even have the money to leave, so they're going to stay and try to work around it, which they're quite good at. But at some point we will there'll be a certain breaking point, especially given that the Southern Sahara, the Sahelian countries have huge demographic growth. So at some point there will just be some new arrangement will have to be found so everybody can find a job and enough to eat and that kind of thing. So that looks quite scary. On top of that, the security situation is pretty bad. So people need to learn how to cope with that. And also I can't tell you that much because I can't actually go right now. So it's also there's less and less information actually coming out of the zone. You can't, with a European passport, you can't really go to Niger. And even if you do, you have to have a military escort. So I still talk to my friends on the phone, but I haven't actually been back to see what is really going on.
Oh my gosh, that was actually my big wrap up question was to ask you when you're going back because I read this book, I'm like, I want to go.
Yeah, well, I do.
Like this place, this place is so diverse. It's filled with such rich history. I won't lie. I actually want to. Like, I read the book. I want to go eat the food. Like, give me the day. Maybe not the boiled flour,
No,
but I will eat. No, I've had camel before. I think it's
very nice either. So
I'm sorry.
stewed camel hump is not very good.
No, it doesn't sound that way. But I would go. I would be a big boy, and if they offered it to me, I would certainly. I had yak recently for the very first time. I was like, and it was stewed, and it was an acquired taste. It was fine. But no, that was the question I asked was like, when do you get to go back?
Well, I'm hoping you can still go to Algeria. So I go back to Algeria quite a lot. And a lot of the people I worked with for the book they've moved anyway. So they tend to be in Algeria or they've moved away from northern Mali because the insecurity is still quite high. But yes, it's not like 10 years ago you could just go and stay and it was all fine. So, but, you just don't know. Maybe things will sort themselves out. But the increasing militarization of the region has not been good. And I have students going back. But
that was my next question was, what about your students? Do your students get to go, or like how are your students relating to this? Because you've got students specializing in this area now as well.
I do. Well, the students who come from the countries in the Sahara, of course, they can go. Nobody can stop them. They often have other difficulties. It doesn't necessarily make it easier if you're from the same place to work there. European students can't go. There's no security clearance, which I can understand. But we're kind of moving towards a world in which the world we actually know from firsthand is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, while the decisions we make are getting more and more important. They're not based on firsthand knowledge. But that's a general for the social.
No, you hit the nail on the head right there. That can't be more frustrating. So, is your next project? Do you get to go back to? For your next project, do you go back to the Sahara then, or do you look to something else?
I don't know. I'd like to, but if it's not possible, I might have to look for something else. I'm thinking.
Fair enough.
What I like about this job is going places and staying there and just living with other people. So I'd like to do it again.
Listen, my friend, you are already in front. The answer I would have is a vineyard. That's where I would be right now, all time, just anywhere. Like you're living, you're actually being an academic in front. Oh, please, I know exactly where I would go. I would give up my writing and just pretend I was Hemingway in 1920, which is probably not the best visual for a lot of our readers.
Yes, I'm sure my colleagues would totally agree with.
I know, right? Right. Judith, I loved this book. This was so great. This is my very first reading I've ever done on the Sahara. I felt like coming to it, the writing and where you took me as a reader was so easily accessible. And I mean that I think sometimes in academia we go, oh, if it's easy to read, it's like this was so good. And it was so inviting to me, and I just want to read more of it. I can't thank you enough for writing this book because I just tore into the book and just kept reading it. And that's the reason why you didn't get an email until a couple days ago, until I finished it. I was like, I have to read the entire book, and so forth. So this has been amazing to read the book, to talk to you today. Now I have to go watch Timbuktu. And maybe I'll go find some wine too. So this has been amazing. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's very nice.